As anyone who has been around on this channel for at least a little while, and especially if you've seen my top 50 favourite vehicles list, you'll know that I have an affinity and certainly a love for a number of gas turbine powered vehicles, and the gas turbine as an engine is my single favourite engine type of all time. And so I naturally have an interest in any kind of gas turbine related, or certainly gas turbine powered road car, concept car, race car, motorbike, of course, as well. But it doesn't happen all that often, and of course less and less in more recent years, whereas way back around the 50s and 60s, and to some degree the 70s, but not so much, more and more companies were trying to look into different ways of doing things, not just with turbines, but with others as well, potentially nuclear-powered cars, of course, more recently, you could say, with BMW, with hydrogen, a number of other things. Electric cars are a perfect example as well, although they didn't really debut, they've actually been a part of the automotive story pretty much since day one, and way back in the day, in vintage car times, electric cars were, I believe, even more popular, if I recall correctly, but they kind of fell out of fashion. Now, this particular vehicle is a Le Mans prototype, a WSC car, and it's one which not many people talk about, which, of course, leads into why it's in this series. Now, as I alluded to, it's gas turbine powered, or at least in a way, because the car is actually a hybrid. Now, the vehicle is called the Chrysler Patriot. It was developed way back around 1993, and this would have been, had it actually raced, the first hybrid Le Mans prototype. Unfortunately, though, that pretty obviously didn't happen, and the first hybrid prototype in the Le Mans actually came from my favourite racing team, Panos, with the Panos so-called Sparky GTR1 car. This one, though, would have been pretty amazing because it goes way beyond being just a conventional hybrid, conventional of course being a relative term that you'd think of now with, say, Audi or Porsche or Toyota. This was completely different. This was more like a hybrid by way of Jaguar CX-75 kind of territory, but of course a couple of decades earlier. Now, Chrysler actually hired a guy called Ian Sharp from the racing world to come in and develop the car, or at least to help them develop it. They intended for the car to be powered by electric motors, so the gas turbine itself would act as more of a generator than a regular engine, which is a little bit of a demerit for me. I would have preferred it if it powered the wheels, but there you go. The whole concept behind the car was to be not just a race winner, but to be a race winner that would have been a great statement for Chrysler as a brand, being a hybrid, proving, of course, as many teams try to, and as Audi has done very well in proving, that hybrids are a viable thing in the racing world, which of course, through this, that and the other, helps sales. In the production sphere, it improves image of the company, it makes people want to own their cars, you know, all that usual stuff that is tied into all motorsports, at least to some degree. Now, this car would attempt a much more radical approach than something like what Audi did with the diesel, because at the end of the day, yeah, why not use a diesel? They're very fuel efficient, they have huge torque, there are definite obvious advantages. With turbines, on the other hand, especially with an electric turbine hybrid, that's not exactly something which many people were trying to champion. So in a way, Chrysler kind of did something cool, trying this different approach. Now, they contacted a company called Williams Engineering, not Williams F1, actually a completely different company who make, among other things, engines for cruise missiles. They have a lot of experience with turbines. Ultimately, though, they went with a different company called Allied Signal, who do a very similar thing, to provide them with some turbine engines. Now, these engines are very small, very lightweight. They weigh only around 190 pounds, and the engine puts out, I believe, at least according to what I could find, around 500 horsepower. Now, the engine runs not on, for instance, diesel in the case of my favourite bike, the Y2K. It doesn't even run on biofuel like Jay Leno's EcoJet. This one's a bit different. This one runs on liquefied natural gas, and it can rev extremely high. In high RPM mode, it can hit 6 figures, 100,000 RPM, which is pretty incredible even if it isn't driving the road wheels. Now, the motors themselves actually allow the car to in effect be all-wheel drive through two kind of independent systems, at least to some degree, and the performance is quoted at being up around 200 miles per hour, at least for a short time. That seems more than good enough in the early 90s. You've got to consider, of course, that you're moving into a slightly newer era when it comes to the Le Mans, around 93, 94, 95, with Porsche winning in their WSC car. And then before that, you've got some other radically different machines, like the Peugeot 905, using a ton of F1 tech, of course the Mazda 787B with its rotary tech. So it was a pretty exciting time, moving away, of course, though, from the Mazdas kind of thing in 91. This one, around 93, that was moving more into the full swing of stuff like F1 bleeding over into the Le Mans, rather than essentially a longer version of Group C in terms of development time. We'd left Group C behind, but the remnants were still there, if you know what I mean. Whereas now we're moving away from that, we're going into very F1-inspired stuff, and this could have been an interesting difference to the rest of the pack. Certainly to many of them, the first hybrid, as I said earlier, would have been a great achievement for Chrysler. Even if it didn't win, it would have drawn a huge amount of chatter, really, like the Delta Wing did for Panoz and Nissan later on as well. And look at all the controversy surrounding that. Now, unfortunately, this car was also surrounded by controversy of one kind or another, because even though the vehicle itself ultimately fell into obscurity, it was, even before that, plagued by two primary issues. Now, one of the issues was an understandable and a completely justifiable one from an engineering point of view. There's nothing really that can be done about that. Problems arise, you try to work around them, sometimes you just can't. On other occasions, though, say it with me, you have corporate politics. And that, unfortunately, is another thing that stuck a thorn into the side of this car's project, because according to Ian Sharp himself, just before he ultimately left the project, he said that there were a number of issues with the development of the car involving and stemming from a number of people trying to take credit for it, trying to spearhead the program. There were various issues with the engine suppliers, the costs of development being up around the $12 million region. They were promised around, I believe it was 50 engineers to be working on these turbines. They ultimately had about 2 at a time, if that. So it was just plagued by all of these issues in a similar way to some of the other great cars in this series, and some which we haven't even talked about yet. So ultimately it's a car which had some very interesting ideas, but one of those interesting ideas was actually the primary one, you could say, from an engineering point of view, that put a halt to it. And that was a very interesting regen system, which of course would ultimately get used in the F1 much, much later, around 2012, because this car used a regenerative flywheel system. The flywheel itself was massive, and it could store a huge amount of kinetic energy, which helped with giving the car additional power, additional boost, etc. And one of the reasons, of course, why it could hit 200 for a short amount of time. Now, as I said, I'm not sure what the combined power from the whole system was, or at least the independent powers combined together of the turbine, the motors, etc. But what I do know, and what I can tell you, is that this flywheel, which apparently was very large, could actually store the equivalent kinetic energy of a truck traveling at 100 miles per hour in terms of the pent-up force inside this flywheel. And that is right behind the driver. So they found that the problem was that developing this car to a point where it would not just win but be safe would mean adding so much shielding to protect the driver from this bomb, in a way, would actually make the car ridiculously heavy. So ultimately, it's a real shame that the technology almost felt like it killed itself to some degree. It was a great idea. In fact, it had many great ideas, but some of them clashed, some of them they didn't deem worthy or worthwhile to continue developing on for cost reasons, political reasons within the company, etc., etc. And it's a shame, because it would have been pretty cool, I think, if this car had a chance to actually prove what it could do. Even if it didn't win, it could have been one of those cars like the Lotus Type 56s, the STP Specials, these cars which were gas turbine powered. They didn't actually win a race, but they were always crowd favourites. They were very interesting, great rivals to the conventional engines, and sometimes they did actually come close to winning. And of course, in the case of something like the Howmet TX, it actually did win. So who knows, maybe Chrysler could have joined the Howmet, you never know, in actually winning and being the second, and to this point, the only second turbine engine car to win a race. Unfortunately, didn't work out that way, and what we ended up with is A very interesting unicorn of the prototype world, certainly an unsung hero, one which was just a little bit too flawed for its own good. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, I'll see you guys next time. And if you are new to this breakdown series of undervalued or weird or wacky cars, then you can check out all of the other episodes, and we've done some pretty cool ones by clicking through at the end. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.